It's probably, in some ways, an appropriate thing because our subject for tonight is very closely allied to the final study in our series on chapter 16. As you'll recall, we've been working through the vials of the wrath of God, and we've got one to go, and that's the seventh vial, which is the pouring out of the divine judgments upon the Catholic system in particular. And what we have in chapter 17 is the lead up to that. We find chapter 17 describing the Harlot System of Rome and challenge the Lamb. These shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them. And the overcoming of this power is the subject matter of that final vial. So they're very closely allied, these two sections of the Apocalypse. And so tonight we're going to have a look at this system of Rome. None of us, of course, need to be convinced that the harlot of Revelation chapter 17 is the Roman system, although that is not universally accepted in our brotherhood, and there have been, in the last few decades, views put forth which have endeavoured to undermine. Tonight we're going to see that the evidence is so obvious and so palpable that you would really have to be blind not to see that the power being spoken of in this chapter is indeed the power of Rome. But first of all, let's just get our assessment of this subject right in terms of prophecy overall. I'm not going to look at the central part of this chart here. I just want to have a look at the two ends of it, the left and the right-hand end of the chart. And we're all, I think, basically familiar with this chart. It deals with the image of Nebuchadnezzar, which is there on the left-hand side, and then the four beasts of Daniel chapter 7, which amplify elements of the metals used in that image. And then it takes us into the Apocalypse. But what we have here over on the right-hand side is the image of Nebuchadnezzar in a shadow form, as it were, because that image actually has to stand up in the latter days. While it was, of course, setting forth those four world empires that we know from history, it was there as a prophecy, as Daniel chapter 2 and verse 28 tells us, of the latter days. So we have the image of Nebuchadnezzar here in the latter days, but you can see superimposed upon that this imagery about which we have read in Revelation chapter 17. We have a woman dressed in scarlet sitting upon a scarlet-coloured beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. That's because the predominant power that Christ will have to overthrow when he overthrows the image of Nebuchadnezzar in the land of Israel and then proceeds to grind it to powder over a period of 40 years, the dominant power that he has to destroy is not Russia. That'll be easy. The victory over Russia will be a matter of weeks, at months at the most. But when it comes to the destruction of the Catholic system, it will take 40 years to destroy that. And so that's the subject matter of Revelation chapter 17. This power. We're going to talk about that and see why it is that it will take 40 years to destroy it. The work of the seventh angel, about which we'll be talking on Wednesday night, God willing, is the work that begins this 17th chapter of Revelation. You see how it begins there in verse 1. And there came one of the 7 angels which had the 7 vials. Let's pause there. So one of the angels that had the 7 vials of chapter 16 makes an appearance to John and invites him to be involved in the work that this angel's going to do. Now, if you had to choose one, which one would you choose? Well, you wouldn't choose the angel of the French Revolution, number 1. But you would choose, wouldn't you, if you think about it carefully enough, the 7th angel of chapter 16 and verse 17 says the 7th angel poured out his vial into the air, and his judgments were against what power? Verse 19. The great city was divided into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell, and great Babylon came in remembrance before God. So the 7th angel has a work to overthrow Babylon the Great. So it is this angel that invites John, in this first verse of chapter 17, to be involved in this work. Now think about that, brethren and sisters and young people, because John is not there to represent John. John is there to represent you and me. He calls himself our companion in tribulation. John is a representative man. He represents all the saints who are going to be involved. And here's the invitation being delivered. And the invitation is in these terms. It says, he talked with me, saying unto me, come hither. Now that phrase, come hither, is the Greek word duro. It means, literally, come along. Come along with me. I want you to be involved in my work. I'm going to pour out the seventh vial of the wrath of God upon Babylon the Great, and I want you, all of you, to be involved in this. We willing? Well, John's going to be there. Whether or not we will be there will depend upon what we do with whatever time is left before that vial is poured out, or, to be sure, before we are called away to the judgment seat of Christ. So that's the invitation that begins this chapter. So it's not a matter that we can say, well, this is very interesting, it's prophecy, it's a bit of history in it. We can sit back and absorb this. Brothers and sisters and young people, this is our future. This is where we are going to go. If we are immortalised at the judgment seat, this is what we will be involved in. So it's a very personal matter. And we read in verse 1 that he's invited to come along, and he's told, I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters. Many waters. What does that represent? Well, I'm going to do for the first time what will be necessary several times in this talk, and that is to actually go forward a bit in the text. Because Revelation chapter 17 is largely self-explanatory. It gives you the interpretation. You don't have to argue about it because it's there on the page. And so it's in verse 15 that we find out what these many waters represent. It says in verse 15, and he saith unto me, the waters which thou sawest, where the whore sitteth, are peoples and multitudes, nations and tongues. So there can be no doubt about that. So here we have John being told, I'm going to show you this great whore, obviously typical of a religious system because it's a woman and a harlot woman to boot. And you're going to be involved in her destruction, John. And I want you to know that she's a very powerful organisation. She sits upon many waters, peoples, multitudes, nations and tongues. So here she is, represented here by this woman, sitting upon this scarlet-coloured beast with its 7 heads and 10 horns. A great whore, she's called. The paramour of world rulers. And we'll talk a bit more about that because that's exactly what goes on in the record to be discussed. This woman. So we read in verse 2, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication. So we're told in verse 1 she sits upon many waters. We're told in verse 15 that that's many nations, peoples and tongues. And then we are told that from this vantage point she commits fornication with many kings. Obviously the kings of those nations over whom she rules, but not just those, as we find out from chapter 18, because there is trading done by this power. Trading in religion. And every power on earth has been involved with this woman in some way. So here we have a woman reigning over the kings of the earth. When you look at the old Roman Empire, it was an area, a very vast area, taking in northern Africa, the bulk of Europe, and certainly all of the countries that fringed the Mediterranean. But we read of this woman in verse 3 that she was in a wilderness. And that's an interesting facet because what that's telling us is that while this power is quite obviously the power of Rome, the woman is ensconced upon many peoples, nations and tongues, and she's seen in a wilderness. Now to the Roman Empire, it was that area to the north of their empire, the area of Germany, right up into what we would call the Baltic nations today, it was that area that they had great difficulty with. And of course it was from that area that the barbarian powers came and made life very difficult for the Roman Empire over a century or two. So it was very much a wilderness. What we're being told here is that when we come to consider Revelation 17, which has to do with the latter days, that Rome would be dominating an area which its ancient empire did not. It would dominate much of the old area. As we know, of course, the image of Nebuchadnezzar will take in the Roman Empire and the territories of it. But she's also dominating to the north of that, to what might be called the wilderness. Called in Ezekiel chapter 20, the wilderness of the peoples. Interesting language, isn't it? The wilderness, not a desert, as a dusty desert like Sinai, but the wilderness of the peoples. And that's where Rome will be dominant. So that's why we have that picture sitting there right in the heart of Europe, taking in all of that area that we know today as Western Europe up to the Baltic nations. So then, in verse 2, this power commits fornication with the kings of the earth. It's exactly what it has done. And when you go back over the history of the 25-year rule of Pope John Paul II, a man who was widely travelled, there was hardly a ruler on the face of the earth worth the name that didn't have at some point an audience with this Pope, either in the Vatican or in their own country. Even rulers like Fidel Castro of Cuba, who you would imagine would be as far removed from the Pope in terms of political ideologies as the East is from the West, even he celebrated the Pope in Cuba. So when you look around the history of the Catholic Church in recent times, it has committed fornication. It doesn't matter about people's ideology. Who cares about Castro being a dyed-in-the-wool communist? Who cares? The Pope went there and took him on. Butted him up. It's like a harlot. She doesn't care who she's involved with, as long as she gets her own way. So here we have this system committing fornication with the kings of the earth, and the inhabitants of the earth, it says, have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. Doesn't matter where you go in the world, you will find the wine of Rome's doctrines influencing not only religion but politics. You don't believe that? Have a look at what Tony Blair's been doing. He's a Catholic. Have a look what they do in America, influencing the direction of American politics. They're everywhere. And the wine of the cup of their fornication is being taken and drunk by all the nations of the earth in some way. It's a system which has its tentacles in every part of the earth. Though it has, of course, suffered as a result of the French Revolution and subsequent events, it has regained much of its power. And it won't be very long before Revelation 17 will be fulfilled, and this power will be riding high, especially in Europe, because all the nations of the earth will commit fornication with it. So we have then, verse 3, he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-coloured beast full of the names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. So who is this power? Let's see if we can nail this down absolutely. Don't need to move out of Revelation 17, because in verse 9 we read this: and here is the mind which hath wisdom, which implies that there will be some minds that don't have wisdom. But here is the mind that's got wisdom. This is how you interpret the 7 heads and the 10 horns of verse 3. This is how you identify the woman who sits astride this scarlet-coloured beast. You have a look at context and history. So what have we got then? Well, verse 9 says, the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth. That's a pretty obvious, a literal fact. As we shall see in a moment, Rome was built on 7 hills, as indeed was Constantinople, which was called the Second Rome. Not sure about Moscow, which was called the third, pretty flat there. But certainly Rome and Constantinople both had 7 hills. But then we read in verse 10, because there's a second interpretation to this 7 heads, and there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen, one is, the other is not yet come, and when he cometh he must continue a short space. Rome, in its history, as we shall see in a moment, had 7 forms of government, and we'll explain what it means when it says one is not yet come, etc. And then the final coup de grace, you might say, from chapter 17, is in the last verse of the chapter, verse 18. And the woman which thou sawest is that great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth. Now, if you applied that prophecy today, you might have people who would argue with you and say, well, I can accept that Rome influences a lot of things in the earth, but it doesn't reign over the kings of the earth today. When you explore the Greek of the verb which reigneth here, you find that it's in the present tense. So it literally should be rendered, which has kingship over the kings of the earth. That is, in the time when John wrote. Now, John was writing in AD 96. And there's no doubt, is there, which city had rulership over the kings of the earth in AD 96. That's beyond all dispute. It was Rome, and John himself was a prisoner of Rome in the island of Patmos. So then, when you put those passages together, verse 9, 10 and 18, and you have a mind that is wise, it's obvious to the wise mind that this is talking about Rome. Now, the Roman Catholic Church itself found that very difficult. They saw it very difficult to swallow, so they created what they call a Douay Bible, get rid of the book of the Revelation. Unfortunately, we've had some people in our own community who have tried to make out that the woman is Israel. But there's absolutely no dispute that this is talking about Rome. When you have a look at history, it becomes fairly obvious. Here is a coin that was minted in around about AD 69. The man, the emperor on the left-hand side here, as you can see from the Latin above him, is Vespasian. He was laying siege to Jerusalem when there was the death of the emperor, and so he made his way back to Rome. There was a little bit of fighting here and there, and he became the emperor, left his son Titus to finish off the job of destroying Jerusalem, which he did very effectively about a year later. On the right-hand side, we have Rome. Notice this. Rome. She's got a helmet on, a helmet of a Roman soldier, but it's a she, it's a woman. And this woman is sitting upon 7 big stones, which represent the 7 hills of Rome. Now, I'm not going to actually spell them out. I walked on a few of those a few months ago. They're not really big hills by Australian standards, but they're hills. So here are the 7 hills of Rome. Roma, that's what they call it even today. So, there can be no doubt when you look at the historical record that when it says in verse 9, the 7 mountains upon which the woman sitteth are the key to understanding what the 7 heads represent. But there's a second one. And the second one of verse 10 is the fact that Rome had 7 forms of government. There was the regal, the consular, the dictatorial, the decemviral, and the tribunicial. All of those preceded the times of John. That's why it says in verse 10, and there are 7 kings, or 7 forms of government. 5 are fallen, that is, they're historical, they're past. And 1 is, that is, in the times of John, it was the imperial form of government. And that says, and when he cometh, and the other is not yet come, and when he cometh, he must continue a short space. So there was to be a 7th form. That form of government was the Gothic form of government, which was instituted at the fall of the Roman Empire in AD 493 and lasted about 60 years. But you will notice if you continue reading in Revelation 17 into verse 11, it says, and the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the seven, and goeth into perdition. So there was to be an eighth head, but the eighth head was actually of the seven. That is, one of the forms of government in the seven was to be revived. Now this is a reference to the revival of the imperial form of government through the years from about 529 AD to 610, from the times of Justinian and of Phocas, emperors of the East. Rome regained her political power that she had lost as a result of the barbarian invasions. And this is the subject matter, as we've considered in our studies, of Revelation chapter 13. It's the subject of the beast of the sea, and we'll have a look at that in a moment very briefly. But it's important to point out that verse 11 says that this eighth head goeth into perdition, or as that word means, destruction. So John is told that what he is seeing here in this eighth head is the final form of Roman government, the imperial form, in its latter day manifestation. And that's the important part as far as we're concerned. Because what we have here is papal power in Europe in our own days and from tomorrow onwards until it is destroyed. So when we see this woman sitting upon this scarlet-coloured beast with its seven heads, we are looking at one of those heads that had some trouble in history. It was overthrown by the barbarians, but it was revived. And though it's had some trouble since, overthrown again as a result of the French Revolution and subsequent events, it is to be revived in the latter days and to stand supreme in Europe. And it is this power, in company with the 10 horns that sit upon those seven heads, that will make war with the Lamb. A bit more about the 10 horns a little later. So here we have down the bottom left-hand corner the imagery of Revelation chapter 13, the beast of the sea, which speaks about the papacy as an imperial political power. But what we see over on the right-hand side is the way that John saw it. This woman upon this beast in the wilderness, sitting upon many waters, is the final form of that imperial power, stacked up against the power of the Lord Jesus Christ and his saints. So that's the drama of Revelation chapter 17. So verse 4 goes on to say, "And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet colour, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication." Now in history, the popes often depicted themselves on coins and such like, holding a cup, because they were the ones who were, of course, trading in their doctrines amongst the nations, and the cup was a symbol of their power being projected. Here, have a drink of this. You'll enjoy this. It's a little bit like some of the drugs they put in spiked drinks today. You don't know who you are after you get involved in that. Here, have a drink. And so the nations would drink of the doctrine of this church. Of course, they're a bit more circumspect about putting that in picture form today. Now, it says in this 4th verse that the characteristic of this woman was that she would be arrayed in purple, which is a royal colour, and scarlet colour. Now, when you look at pictures of the Pope, the current Pope, on the day of his election, about this time last year, this is the garment that the popes wear. Now, Pope John Paul II almost wore this one out. It might in fact be a new one. But you'll notice that it is gilded with gold. They don't mess around. This is not fake gold out of a can sprayed onto something. You can be assured of that. This is dinky dye gold, gilded. And it says here in verse 4, if you have the same margin in your Bible that I've got in mine, you'll see for the word decked, gilded. That's what that word means. So here we've got the Pope dressed in scarlet, which is peculiarly the colour of the cardinals of the Roman Catholic Church. But he has something extra. He's got all this gold woven in to his garment. So it's not hard to begin to identify what this represents when it talks about this power, gaudily apparelled with precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abomination and filthiness of her fornication. It is this system of Rome. But let's move on to verse 5, because verse 5 tells us the origins of this power. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great. And I marvel at the way in which the translators have put this in bold capitals, because of course they were largely Protestants who were doing this, and they knew who this was talking about. Babylon, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. The only problem was they were daughters. See what it says? Abominations of the earth. Abomination to who? Well, to the Spirit, to Yahweh, the eternal Spirit. He regards this system as being utterly abominable, and her daughters as not much better, if at all. So to be associated or involved with this power, either by adopting its doctrines or its practices, or being associated with it in some kind of communal spirit or ecumenical approach, as far as he is concerned, is an utter abomination. And I've marvelled in my travels. I've heard of many things, even of a Christadelphian ecclesia that built a hall in a town, in a country, in conjunction with the Roman Catholic Church and some others. Unbelievable. But it happens. It's almost as though they've been drugged. Their eyes are closed. They can't see. And yet that is the way the Spirit talks about this power. Its origins are in Babylon, right back into the days of Nimrod. And here is the Tower of Babel. And there is Nimrod down here, the first god king. You can see people doing obeisance to him, bowing down as this enormous tower is built. And that's exactly what the nations of Europe are doing today. They are rebuilding the Tower of Babel. This was their poster for the European Union. Europe, many tongues, one voice. They've even got modern cranes building the Tower of Babel. When they built their parliament in Strasbourg in France, opened in 1999, they built it on the pattern. Oh, that's a finished building, by the way. You know, the bits at the top there, that's not unfinished business. That's purposeful. That's the plan. Because it was based on the Tower of Babel. So the European Parliament is an objective demonstration of what the European nations are about. They're rebuilding ancient Babylon. And of course they've taken their 12 stars, we know, from the Catholic Church, which took them from Revelation chapter 12, the 12 stars around, they say, Mary, the woman, in fact, the harlot woman, who was with child by fornication, we would say. So there's no doubt, is there, as to what is happening in Europe today. Now I just want to spend a little bit of time, because we don't have a great deal of time, demonstrating the origins, the roots of the Roman Catholic Church in Babylon. Now we could spend 3 nights on this and still not exhaust it. So let's just take a couple of things which are fairly clear. Janus, not talking about Janus, Janice, we're talking about Janus. Janus was a Roman god in the days of paganism in Rome. Janus was the god of doors and gateways, and also of beginnings. Hence we have our month January. So every time the calendar clicks over from December to January, it's an acknowledgement of this god, in a sense, because he has given his name to the beginning of the year. It's a very powerful, very prominent god. The temples of this god Janus always faced towards the east. The back of the temple faced towards the west. That's pretty obvious, isn't it? If he's the god of beginnings, then every day when the sun comes up from the east, shines into the temple, and when the sun goes down, passing off into the west. Between the two doorways, the front and the back of the temple of Janus, stood his statue with two faces, each one gazing in opposite directions, to show he had absolute control. He began and he ended. Watch out for Janus. Two faces, there they are. Now those two faces, one was young and the other was old. One of them represented Nimrod, the other one represented his reincarnation, Tammuz. Now those of you who know the history will know that Nimrod died at about 40 years of age through some mysterious circumstances. So they buried him. His wife, Semiramis, being the sort of woman she was a harlot. She got involved with someone else. She had a child. The child was born, and she said that this child was Nimrod reincarnated. This is the new Nimrod. And they set up certain festivals. One of them was the festival of Saturnalia. Saturnalia, which is held on the 25th of December in the northern hemisphere and now in the south, was the festival of the old sun. Like Nimrod, he died. He went down because the sun reaches its lowest point in the northern sky on the 25th of December, just like it does in the southern hemisphere on the 21st or 22nd of June. Then the next day, of course, the sun would begin to renew itself and would climb higher in the sky as time went on. So they said, well, the old sun, Nimrod, dies, the new one, Tammuz, is revived. And the Bible actually speaks of this in several places, particularly in Ezekiel, in other language. So this pagan festival of Saturnalia is taken up in January, Janus. January is the month when the northern hemisphere experiences a bit more sunshine because the sun is rising in the sky, staying a bit longer in the sky, and so it opens up a new era. This is how they worshipped Janus. Well then, his symbols were a key and a cock, a rooster. There he is. Not hard to see why, is it? This is the God of doors and gateways. He opens doors, opens the new year, and he opens the new day. And what happens at the beginning of a new day? Well, the rooster. He crows. So it's obvious as to why they chose the key and the cock. Now, cardinals, who are a prominent part, these are the men who choose the new pope from amongst themselves. Their name comes from cardo in the Latin. It means hinges, because they control the doors. They have the power. You want to become pope? You've got to be part of them, and they will vote you in. The pope, as far as they're concerned, is God on earth. That's how much power they've got. So this is derived from the priests of Janus that go right back to the times of Semiramis, who was the god of doors and hinges and gateways. You know what colour the priests of Semiramis, the inner circle, the only ones who could access her, what colour dominated their clothing? You're right, red, scarlet. The lower priests, the ones who couldn't access her, they tended the fires. Their garments were appropriately black. You couldn't see the soot. All comes from ancient Babylon. Now have a look at modern Rome today. We're looking down from above, which they couldn't do in ancient times, by the way. When they built the Vatican, nobody could look down on Rome like this, but they knew what they were doing. Now those of you who've got very good eyes will look down the bottom corner here, and you will notice something. If you can see, you need a binoculars from the back there. But what you will see is that the north is actually pointing to what we would call southwest. So this picture is not really, it's not sort of on the page as we would normally put a picture on the page. So what that means, brothers and sisters and young people, is that this building here, which is in the shape of a key, you'll notice, this building actually faces due east. The sun rises from over here. That's why when I was there on a morning in July last year, I got sunburnt. because it was shining directly down this avenue, straight under here, and I spent a lot of time standing up on the platform and up on this top of the building here. And the sun, which was about 10:30, 11 o'clock in the morning, was beaming down on me. It didn't even occur to me at the time. But isn't that interesting? That when they built the Vatican in the shape of a key, they made sure that it faced the east and its back was the west. Why do they do that? Because this is a temple of Janus, derived from the times of Nimrod, cultured through the Roman pagan era and put into the Roman Catholic system at the headquarters of that system. It's amazing, isn't it? So what we've got here is the key of Janus. Now, most of you will be aware that our Lord Jesus Christ said to Peter, "Before the cock crows twice, thou shalt deny me thrice." Just happens that, well, they make that connection. There is a cock involved here, and there's a key in the hand of this two-headed Janus, one of his head representing Nimrod, the other one Tammuz. Just in case you didn't get the point, when you walk into the door at the front of the building, where the sun shines in the morning, there are two keys there. The keys of the kingdom of heaven. So Janus is very prominent in that building. Second thing, what about the term pontiff? Well, pontiff actually means a bridge builder. So he's a power, he believes, that brings people together. He builds bridges between people and God. And the Pope is acknowledged as the Pontifex Maximus of the Roman Church. Pontifex Maximus. Maximus, obviously, that means big, chief. Pontifex, the bridge builder. Here he is, the chief bridge builder. And the title of pagan Roman emperors was Pontifex Maximus. They were the official high priests of the pagan mysteries. The title can be traced back to the times of Nimrod. He was the first Pontifex Maximus. And it's interesting that the supreme pontiff of paganism bore the Chaldean title Peter. The Chaldean title Peter, which meant to Chaldeans, interpreter of the mysteries. And the office of Pontifex Maximus, or chief priest, was to declare and interpret the divine law and to preside over all of the sacred rites of that church, if I might use that term. And when you go into the Vatican, there's one thing, there's many things that will interest you, but there's one thing that will dominate your vision. There are memorials throughout that building, internally, on the outer walls, up on the roof. Here I was looking down. All these vents on the roof, the dome of the Vatican. Every single one of them had on it Pope something, Pontiff or Pontifex Maximus. And here in the marble floor, Pope Clemens VIII, Pont Max. You didn't get the point? Down here, Pont, Pontifex Maximus. Wherever you went, you got this title, because there are memorials to all the popes, and they are the head of this system for their brief space of time. And so this term, Pontifex Maximus, is everywhere to be seen. These are the successors of Nimrod. And we've heard, haven't we, how they got that title, because when Babylon was overthrown and the religion of Babylon was unwanted, the Babylonian priests went into Asia Minor. They ended up being installed in a little kingdom called Pergamum. And Pergamum was ceded by its ruler to Rome. That is, he gave his kingdom to Rome. And so Rome had a ready-made Pontifex Maximus that could take over the pagan mysteries and the rites of paganism. And the Catholic Church simply borrowed all that and made their head the Pope, their Pontifex Maximus. We read on in Revelation 17 and at verse 5, she is the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. Mother of harlots. Now, ancient harlots displayed their name on their forehead. Today they put their names in newspapers. But in those days they didn't have newspapers. So if you wanted to advertise yourself, there were no billboards, as far as we know. How would you advertise yourself as being the local harlot? Well, in those days they took out a crayon or something and they wrote their name on their forehead and went around saying, "Here I am." No mobile phones, You had to actually go out face to face to meet your customers. Says in this prophecy that she was the mother of harlots, and on her forehead in verse 5 she's got a name written, Mystery. Just so happens that that word mystery was once engraved on the papal tiara, which he wore in public. So here is this system, setting forth herself as the mother of harlots. And moreover, when you go to the Vatican, one of the first things you will see out of the top corner of your eye, as you walk up the pavement to go in, is this picture up on the wall of the place where they actually nominate and appoint popes, the Sistine Chapel. Rome proclaims herself publicly as the mother and mistress of all the churches, calls herself Mater Ecclesia, Mother Church. So there can be no doubt as to who we're dealing with here. And there can be no doubt as to why Yahweh feels the way he does towards this system, as to why he calls her an abomination. Read the next verse, verse 6. And I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs or the witnesses of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered with great admiration. Now Rotherham translates that. And I was astonished with great astonishment. He wasn't admiring her. He marvelled. That's what it says in verse 7. Why did you marvel? He was astonished at this system. And he had good reason to be. Because she was drunk with the blood of the saints. Now, I'm not going to labour this. We've talked about this before. It's an awful subject because every time I look at these pictures, I think that some of these people treated like this could have been our brethren. And even if they weren't brethren and sisters and young people, you don't treat people like this. When God wants to kill his enemies, he kills them. He doesn't torture them. We read about Korah, Dathan and Abiram in our readings today. If anybody should have been tortured from a human perspective, it should have been those fellas. What did God do with them? He said, "Get away from them." Then he opened up the earth and they went down, crying out as they did. Down they went, whammo, gone. And the other bunch, the 250, including Korah, standing at the door of the tabernacle, fire from heaven, whoop, barbecue. No torture in that. But when this power deals with its enemies, this is what it does with them. Look at this fella. He's got his hands tied behind his back with a rope tied on it. He's up on a pulley. And they're pulling him up. You just imagine this, the weight of your body being held by your arms like that. If that's not good enough, have a good look down below his feet. And you'll see they've put a 100-weight there. Just to make sure there's plenty of pressure. Look at this fella here. And the one lying on the table. And these guys down here. It's all happening to them all in the one room. And who's presiding over it? The cardinal. Now we know why God calls them abomination. Not only have they corrupted the minds of men and blinded men to his truth, but this is what they do to his people, his witnesses, to their enemies. This is why, brethren and sisters and young people, the invitation goes out. Come along. Come on. Come along. The day of vengeance is coming. She's drunk with the blood of the saints. Little wonder that John marvelled. And the picture on the right-hand side, you reckon this is not a modern thing? All right, you can go back. This is the Inquisition. But what about over here on the right-hand side? You know who this fella is over here? Little moustache under his nose? Adolf Hitler. And this is the papal nuncio, the personal representative of the Pope in Germany. And they are discussing, so it is said, some of the problems they had. How to get rid of the Jews, number one. And the Catholic Church was very interested in getting rid of everybody else that opposed them. And they got their way in a little country called Croatia. You want to read the history of the Ustasi movement. In the period of the Second World War, when Germany had captured the area of Yugoslavia, or at least most of it, Tito was fighting against them. When they captured that area, the Croatians asked permission to get rid of their enemies, Jews, Protestants, Muslims, and anybody else who opposed the Catholic Church. Hundreds of thousands of people were brutalised, killed in the streets by the Ustasi. So the Catholic Church was doing this sort of thing right down to the end of World War II. I was born 3 years after the end of World War II. So it's pretty recent, although some of you don't think I'm that recent. Now you know why God has the feelings he has about this system. Drunk with the blood of the saints. So we move on. Verse 7, the angel said unto me, why did you marvel? I will tell thee the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carrieth her, which hath the 7 heads and 10 horns. The beast that thou sawest was and is not. It was, because John had seen this beast before. He saw it in Revelation chapter 13. It's the beast of the sea. But it is not, because you see, when John wrote this, that power hadn't come into existence. He had seen it. He knew it was going to come, but it was not. And it shall ascend out of the bottomless pit, the abyss, that is the abyss of Europe, and go into destruction. And they that dwell on earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was and is not, and yet is. It is because, John, you're seeing it again, and you're seeing it as it will be in the day of its destruction. So the content of chapter 17 was very important to John. It was going to be part of his work. We've read verse 9, we've read verse 10. So we'll move on to verse 12. Because in verse 12 we read, and the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. Now we're familiar with these 10 horns. They are the same as the 10 toes of the image of Nebuchadnezzar of Daniel chapter 2. They're the same as the 10 horns of the 4th beast of Daniel chapter 7. They are the same as the 10 horns which sit upon the 7 heads of the beast of the sea of Revelation chapter 13. So it's not a new symbol. It represents those nations of Europe that were formed by the barbarian invasions of the Roman Empire in the 4th and 5th centuries AD. They are the European countries of today. Well, of course, you say to me, but there are 25 members of the EU and they want to get more. So what about this 10? Now, some brethren have thought, well, maybe it will be more than 10. Brethren and sisters, when God says there will be 10, there will be 10. You're not talking about today. Revelation 17 is about the power of the Roman system in the day when Christ destroys it. That'll take him 40 years. But it's in that day that there will be 10. And I have every confidence that when that day comes, There will be 10 prominent nations of Europe who will be the base of the power of the papacy on that continent. So these 10 kings, it says in verse 12, have received no kingdom as yet. They're not crowned yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. Now, in previous studies, we've spent some time talking about this 1 hour, and I'm not going to spend any more time on it. 1 hour, as I think all of you are aware, is the apocalyptic way of saying 30 years. It can be easily proven, no question about what it represents. 30 years. So it's saying that these 10 powers of Europe will have power with the beast for 30 years. Now, I'll show you an illustration in a moment that actually represents that I think will become a little bit clearer. But I want to move on to verses 13 through to verse 17. It says of these 10 horns, these nations of Europe, these have one mind and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. Now, why should that be an unusual thing? The way it's spoken there, it almost seems as though, well, you know, they had another choice. They will have one mind and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. You know anything about European nations, you'll know this. They have great difficulty having one mind on anything. Have a look at France today. The government's trying to introduce policies to improve the economy, which is going down the gurgler, and you've got students in the streets and other idiots joining them and making life very difficult for the French government, like they did last November, so that country is in absolute turmoil. The French and the Germans who head up the EU, supposedly friends, have difficulty agreeing on anything except that the EU should be promoted. So when it says that these have one mind and shall give their power and strength unto the beast, that's saying something. And it's saying something. When you get down to verses 15 to 17, we are told why this would be difficult. I'm going to put up this illustration, which you've seen before. Because we're told in verses 16 and 17 that these 10 horns, in their history, would at one point hate the whore, but later, under the influence of God, and that's a very important thing to recognise, would submit to Rome's rule. Now here's the timeline of papal history for the last 200 years. The French Revolution was an absolute disaster for the Roman Catholic Church, especially in France. Culminating in 1870 with the loss of temporal, that is, political power by the papacy in Italy. They were turfed out. No longer did the papacy have any political power. So 1870 was the low point of papal history. That was the end result of all of the revolutions and things that happened as a result of the French Revolution. But the papacy never gave up. They slowly began to rebuild their power. In 1929, Mussolini, the Duce, gave temporal power back to the Pope, and he gave him Vatican City, which is actually a separate country. Sits right in the middle of Rome. It's a country. It's got its own ambassadors. It does as it pleases. The Italian government can't do anything. It's a country within their own country. So the Pope got back at least some measure of temporal or political power in 1929. By 1957, 6 nations met in the Campidoglio in Rome and signed the agreement under the auspices of the papacy called the European Common Market, now known as the EU. Had 6 nations then, it's now got 25. And then, of course, along came Pope John the 23rd, and he called the Second Vatican Council and shifted the church towards socialism and the left. And then along comes John Paul II, steers the church back to orthodoxy, but at the same time humanises the church. And today we have a pope from Germany, which is very interesting, because Germany is going to be the power base of the papal system when it's destroyed by Christ. We don't know what's going on exactly. They don't put out bulletins of what they're doing. They do it secretly. You only find out a little later on. But we can be absolutely assured that they are establishing firmly their power in Europe. There are many things that indicate to us that that's happening. Not the least of the fact is that recently, in 2004, based upon what happened in this Campidoglio, did you get a feel for that? You have a look down this end of the building. There's the doorway. It's locked, by the way. Janice has got the key. And over here you've got a pope. That's actually a statue of a pope with his hand out over. So anyone comes in here is under the control of the papacy. And here are all these venerable gentlemen in 1957 sitting down to sign the European Economic Agreement, the Common Market they called it. Signed on the 25th of March 1957. France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Italy and West Germany. 6 of them. Interesting, isn't it? The number of the papacy. And in 2004, guess what? They turned up in the same room. Here he is. He hasn't deteriorated much, has he? Still the same man with his hand out. Here's the European flag. There is the 12 stars down here. And all of these people... There's some women in the room at this stage. There weren't any women in the room that I could see in 1957. But there's a few of them here. And they're signing on the dotted line the Constitution of the European Union. Well, of course, it's in trouble. But it was signed here in Rome, in that very same room. And the scripture says, these have one mind and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. Now you've got people sitting in that room when they signed this constitution who were gnashing their teeth privately, like Tony Blair, for instance. He's a Catholic. He had to smile. Give me the pen. He's gnashing his teeth. He doesn't want to be under the power of the Pope. These will have one mind. Why did they do it? Why did they grab the pen? When in some cases it wasn't in their national interest to sign the document introducing the Constitution, because God put it in their hearts. That's what it says, you see. Verse 16. And the 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast, actually should read and the beast, these shall hate the whore, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. They did that in the French Revolution, 1789, right through the times of Napoleon, when men gnawed their tongues for pain and were burnt with fire. Right down to 1870. These European nations, they threw away the papal controls. They hated the whore. Oh, but it's a different situation now. And you see there's a change of subject in verse 15. You notice the words that begin verse 15? And he saith unto me. So John is telling us that he's being taken back a bit in history. He's being shown what happened before these nations of Europe would have one mind to support the papacy. This is why it's taken so long, brethren and sisters and young people, for the 6th vial. It's taken all that time because of what happened to the Catholic Church in the French Revolution and beyond. That had to be repaired. The European nations had to give their power to the beast. That was going to be a work of time, and it has been. So it says in verse 17, for God hath put in their hearts to fulfil his will and to agree and give their kingdom unto the beast until the words of God shall be fulfilled. So don't ever forget the involvement of God in what we have been seeing. We talk about signs of the times, brethren and sisters. We look at it and we can almost look at it as though, well, that's very interesting what the angels are doing. But what they are doing and what comes to pass is because God has willed it. It doesn't matter whether nations want to go that way or not. It doesn't matter if they elect someone who wants to go in a different direction. God will make them agree. Let's remember that. Because that means what we're reading about is going to come to pass, regardless of how it looks. It's absolutely certain. The only uncertainty is whether or not we will be there as a result of the invitation. Come along. Come on. Come along. That depends on what we do. So here they are, gathering in Rome, under the watchful gaze of Mary above and of Caesar below. Rome has got them in her hand, the mother and mistress of all the churches, dominating the Rome of the Caesars. Little wonder, in chapter 18 and verse 7 she says, I sit a queen and am no widow, and shall see no sorrow. Here we are, facing the east, in the temple of Janus, looking at the handle of the key. And all her suitors, all the kings of the earth, have committed fornication with her and will continue to do so. And the 10 horns, the 10 nations of Europe, will give her her power base, and they will have power with her 1 hour until she and they are destroyed. And that's what verse 14 is about. So here we have the end of the matter. You've seen this before, nothing new in it. This is the pattern of Roman Catholic resistance to Christ for 40 years after Armageddon. 10 years after Armageddon, Rome itself will be destroyed. And then comes a period of intense conflict, 30 years to conclude those judgments. And it's in this period of 30 years, from the fall of Rome to the end of those judgments, that the 10 horns received their power, 1 hour with the beast. And the reason for that's very simple. It is this: that during this period of history, brethren and sisters and young people, Rome will go through 2 phases. The first phase will be the beast of the sea phase. A woman riding upon a scarlet-coloured beast, which is very similar to the one seen in chapter 13. Rome will have political power. She will have joined herself with Russia in the east. Russia will control Constantinople. There's the 2 legs. Constantinople in the east, Rome in the west. And just as it was in history, when the emperors that had ensconced themselves in the second Rome, in Constantinople, gave power to the Bishop of Rome in the west, beginning with Justinian, 529 to 533, and ending with Phocas, 608 to 610, when the Pope came into existence as being the head of all the churches and was given political power. Just as it was in history, so that phase will be seen again. Russia will have given power to the papacy. But when Russia is destroyed in the land of Israel, the Pope will have to look for other suitors, just as it happened in history. In the years 600 to 700 AD, the papacy fell out with the Roman emperors in the east. They argued over idolatry of all things. And so the emperors in the east washed their hands of the papacy. Said, you want to have idols? That's fine. Go and find someone else to fight your battles. So the Pope cast around, and he looked firstly to Pepin, King of France, and then to his son, Charlemagne. And in 800 AD, the Pope crowned Charlemagne as the first king of the Holy Roman Empire. And if you read Eureka, you will find that when Brother Thomas talks about the eighth head of verse 11, he makes this little point. He says this eighth head, in its final phase, is the Holy Roman Empire. They will finally have rebuilt it. Napoleon destroyed it. They will have rebuilt it. And so, what happens at the end of that period of judgment is that the beast of the earth is back in existence again. Here is the final revival of the beast of the earth, the Holy Roman Empire. And it's that power which goes into perdition or destruction. And you and I will be involved in it. Have a look at verse 14. And these shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them. For he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. These people, you and me, brethren and sisters, are people who have an Abrahamic hope, who will be with Abraham and with John and many others to bring vengeance upon this system that has persecuted so many of God's saints and of his witnesses down through the ages, and has blinded men's minds with a drugged cup. When it says here that they that are with him are called, Abraham was called out of Ur the Chaldees, the very heart of Babylonian apostasy. He was brought from Babylon, so to speak. Nehemiah 9 verse 7 says, he was chosen by God to carry his name in the earth. And Romans 4, Paul tells us in verse 13 that Abraham became heir of the world by faith. He's going to have some companions in that day. John's going to be one of them, because John, you see, took up the invitation. Come along. John proved himself in life to be called, chosen, and faithful. Let us hope, brethren and sisters and young people, when verse 14 is fulfilled, as we shall see on Wednesday night, God willing, as it will be in the pouring out of the seventh vial, that you and I will be amongst that great company.